Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and you're all very welcome to the second day of Women in the Media at Ballybunion. We have to commend Joan on her general organisational skills, but if she keeps up delivering the weather in this way, next year I'm afraid we're going to have to decamp to the beach. So, just a bit of housekeeping before we start. Joan has asked me to mention a little bit of the schedule for the rest of today and for tomorrow. So I'm going to talk shortly about the panel here this morning, but after this panel we're going to have a political symposium which celebrates 100 years of the role of vote for Irish women. And it's a really impressive panel of women who are going to be here. We have Mary O'Rourke, Dr. Rona O'Mahony, Alice Mary Higgins, Mary Minahan and Ellen McCafferty. Tomorrow then we have the panel discussion which is about growing up in the 21st century and the challenges that brings to today's adolescents and younger people. Following that we have an addition to the schedule which is a discussion about photography in news and how important it is. And again there'll be a panel discussion chaired by Jane Last from INM, and your own Derry Keneally will be on the panel, as will Jerry Mooney, an award-winning photographer. So just back to today's business. And I also have to mention the hashtag, because Joan has warned me, advised me, that nobody is ever getting out of this hotel unless we're trending on Twitter at some stage today. So you've been warned. The question today, ladies and gentlemen, is, it's Women in the Media, 2018, apology. So the question today, ladies, is, can the truth be rebuilt in a post-truth era? And we're living in a time when we're bombarded with information. So can truth be told? Yes, it can, but it may need to be deciphered. And perhaps we must look for guardians of guidance to help us with the path to truth. And if we're looking for guardians of the truth, can there be any distinction between men and women in the media to deliver that truth? In my opinion, the answer is no. Men and women can deliver the truth equally. However, it's fair to say that in Ireland, we're very fortunate to have many women at the cutting edge of delivering today's news. In the miasma of men and suits and shirts and ties that we have been once accustomed to, there is now a welcome development and things have started to change. Now, a number of women in Ireland not only hold their own, but set the benchmark for content, analysis, opinion and cutting edge news. Are women as prevalent as we would like them to be? No. Are things getting better? Yes, they are. And how did that happen? It happened because of our mothers and our grandmothers. And we have a responsibility now, as women in the media, to build on that success and to do more. Many women are crafting and shaping the news behind the scenes every day. Others are household names. Whether you're a woman in the media, or whether you're a woman who reads the media and gets your information from the media, you have still a role to play. Today we're very fortunate to have a selection of women to speak on the topic of truth-seeking. They're not here because they're defined by their gender. They're here because they're the very best at what they do. Our first panellist is an excellent example of that distinction. It's Ellen Coyne. Ellen is a journalist with the Times Ireland, and she's worked on many significant and important stories and has highlighted lots of women's issues. In particular, some of her important work has prompted change on crisis pregnancy issues. She's a former journalist at the BBC, and perhaps most prominently of late, her investigative work on Leo Varadkar's communications unit precipitated a political debate which saw the winding up of that unit. The seeds of her story prompted a change in a €5 million spend of taxpayers' money. Sometimes political machinations take over, but it's often those seeds of a story which make the significant difference. Against a lot of pressure, Ellen stuck by her story, not just in print, but also on the air. We're also joined today by Susan Daly. Susan is the editor of the journal.ie, and she's someone who's moved from the traditional press as we know it to become Ireland's leading digital news provider. Susan not only leads a news team who delivers content to over 300,000 daily users, she also plays a significant role in the development of future newsmakers by sitting on an advisory institute for DCU, future media and journalism. Also we have this morning Caitriona Perry. Caitriona is a multi-award winning journalist. She's responsible for bringing Donald Trump into our living rooms as a politician. So Caitriona, but in fairness, when many others discounted Trump as a joke candidate. Caitriona took her job as a fact-finding journalist very, very seriously. And as such, she delivered the news from the 2016 campaign trail in a calm and considered manner. It's not an easy task when you're dealing with the cataclysmic upheavals that enveloped US and global politics. Now Caitriona is in her living rooms every evening herself as an anchor on the 6-1 News. And when she was appointed to that position with her colleague Coyne, the press paid a lot of attention to the fact that 2 women would anchor the news. And some people asked why. But to quote a genuinely impressive American world leader, why not? We should also take the opportunity to congratulate Caitriona, and this is news to her also, that she was honoured last night at Dublin City University with an alumni award for significant achievement. I could go on. I could go on through the myriad of the positions that she's held in stations such as News Talk and Today FM, but what's the point? She survived the Trump election, she survived the transition period, and she survived the presidential era without being sacked, so that's a significant achievement in itself. And finally, I think as far as Ballybunion and women in the media are concerned, we come to Katie and Miriam as a sort of double act. Individually, they're very impressive and both exceptionally effective in their individual careers. Again, I could go through everything they've done, but they've been around a bit. And I don't want to take up the whole hour. But they're both strong, powerful, beautiful, and you can say that about women, they're beautiful, leaders. And they share many, many similarities. They're both unafraid to ask questions. They both have a commitment to the truth. And perhaps the most impressive thing about them is that they both share a genuine love and respect for their craft, journalism. Separately, they're impressive, but they support each other, and that's really important. Together, they're a shining example of how working together as women, we can be stronger. Anyway, as a double act, in my opinion, they're undoubtedly uniquely impressive. At least one of them should be president someday. Anyway, women in the media is very important, not because it brings women in the media together, because every day we're together in the D4 bubble. Women in the media is important because we're entirely outside of that bubble, and that's what gives this unique dynamic. So anyway, I'm going to hand over to my friend Katie now, because when it comes to finding the truth, I can genuinely, Miriam, think of no one better, and I look forward to an interesting discussion from some exceptionally talented people who just happen to be women.
Thank you, Mandy. And everyone's wondering, why is there this number of people here when we didn't mention one?
I'm outside the D4 bubble.
This is what happens when you're outside the D4 bubble. This is just another example. It's not the gender divide, it's the D4 versus the rest divide.
It's more serious.
I want to apologise on behalf of Mandy. And I'll say it'll never happen again in my presence. The other panellist, our top secret panellist, is of course Dio Shaughnessy from 96 FM. Obviously a great supporter of this over the last number of years. We're delighted to have her on the panel. Anyone, everyone will know her from online because she's very active online as well. That's how I first came across UD. And obviously, if you listen to the Cork FM, which so many people do, you'll know her from her excellent show. So I think we should just about get to it. I just wanted, the idea of this, just because it kind of touches a bit on what we did in this panel session last year, but when we were thinking about what to do this year, and I was kind of throwing around a few ideas, there's the most infuriating thing a news editor can say to a reporter when they're assigning a task. They tell you what you have to do and then they tell you, sure, it'll write itself. Stories never, in all my history of doing stories, have ever written themselves. But this one did seem to write itself in my own head because as time went on we had Ellen's Strategic Communications Unit story that had so many different angles in terms of what can you believe, what are you being told that's not true, can you even believe what's being said in the Dáil. Then we had the Trump stuff was rolling on again, then the Brexit story and the really astonishing spin that has been put on Brexit, particularly in the British press, if you've been following that. And then, just as we were coming up closer to this, we had Cambridge Analytica and the whole Facebook data weaponising all of that. So really, you just suddenly realised, you're taking all this in, and you suddenly realise you're much more nervous about sharing a story. I find anyway that you might, something that you would have retweeted without thinking from a source you would have considered reliable 6 months ago. I now have like double, triple, quadruple thoughts about, well, where did they get that story from? Could this be another one of those spun stories? And like, if somebody who is immersed in media, and if it's their job, and somebody like ourselves are wondering and worried and concerned about that, what hope for people who are kind of casually dipping in and out of media, and that discombobulation that this whole fake media storm has, what it's done to all of us in terms of how we consume media, I think is just a hugely, hugely, hugely important issue for us and for everyone in terms of how do we view the world, and how can we accept what's real and what's not real. So that's why I'm delighted we're doing this, and I'm delighted to invite Susan Daly from the journal.ie to open up our discussion this evening.
Do you want to go here?
Well, you can leave. You want to stay where you are?
Shall I go this? Yeah. Look, I'll come over if I want to talk a few minutes.
Yeah.
Multitasking with microphones that you have to hold as well. I'd rather just stand up and have the work done for me. So I don't know if most people here are familiar with the journal.ie. It's online only, and I worked in newspapers for a very long time, and I'm 20 years in total in the media. And for, I suppose, quite a long time at the start of the journal, the thing that people said was to me, oh my goodness, the biggest transition we have here is the media and news consumption going to online. But for me, and Katie's hit the nail on the head here, the thing that's really changed, particularly in the last few years, is that people, and that's all of us in this room, including myself, and I'm going to give you a little anecdote that happened this week that really brought it home to me. The information we're getting now, if we are looking at things online, it's not so much from the media. So there's a lot of talk about fake news, and actually even the term fake news, I think, can be a little misleading. Because if you hear Trump, and I know Caitriona will talk about this, but if you hear Trump using the term fake news, he doesn't necessarily always use it about things that are untrue. He uses it about things that don't fit into his worldview or the message that he's trying to get across. So I really think we need to stop thinking about fake news and think about disinformation. Because as Katie says, sometimes we share things, and it's not out of a motivation. We're not a Russian spy trying to take down Leo Varadkar or some sort of weird construction like that. We're often sharing it out of good intentions, believing we need to warn people in our circle about it. This week I had my father-in-law. He was one of the last of about 4 people who sent me another WhatsApp message warning me of a Martinelli virus. Okay, if anyone sent that this week, stop sending it on, okay? It's like a chain letter. So I said to him, I said, Dave, God, this is not live streamed, right? My father-in-law will not see this, right? I said to him, Dave, this isn't true. This is a hoax. And I said it goes back to Spain last year in the summertime. That's where it emerged. And I sent him the link to the National Police sending out a tweet clarifying that this was false. What it was doing is trying to entice people to download an update to WhatsApp, which wasn't really an update to WhatsApp, which could actually damage your phone. So delete that message if you do have it. And he said to me, actually, I wrote down when he wrote back and he went, oh, I got it from 2 totally reliable sources. Fake news, lol. And I asked him, what are the 2 totally reliable sources? And he said, his bridge partner and his dentist. Now, 2 years ago, I came back off maternity leave, and I was a month out from the general election. And I was facing into that and thought, what can we do to better serve people coming to look for information about the general election? And I started the Journal's fact-checking project within the newsroom. Thank you, Sarah. It's brilliant. Sarah said it's brilliant. And we kept it for the general election. What we did was we stopped publishing policies and promises from parties and instead fact-checked them, which they didn't really like, but sure, look. And it made it very easy during live debates then to do a live blog and say, well, no, we fact-checked that, that's not true. No, that's not true. No, those jobs didn't come from there. Or that is true, because fact-checking is also dealing with facts and sending out something that might be unpalatable to what you, because we all have personal prejudices, might believe. And sometimes the results of our fact checks have actually surprised me and challenged me and my perceptions, and I think that's really important in the media if we are trying to rebuild trust, that we do accept that we're not always right. But we started this, so Dave knows that I started this 2 years ago. We've kept it on. We've become the only Irish verified organisation for the International Fact Checking Network. And generally, gone to conferences, talked about it, we're doing good work. And but still, his dentist and his bridge partner had authority and credibility that I did not. So as a result, we've done a quick and dirty fact check on the Martinelli virus, which is on the journal today, so that I can get him to look at the journal. Anyway, that's the abuse of power that you can have when you're the editor of something. So what I'm saying though is that he sent that round in really good intentions, trying to save us from ourselves, and he's a very intelligent, educated man. The point is that this is what post-truth is. Who the expert is has completely changed. The expert used to be the media and other people, academics, scientists and so on. The expert now is the person that, because the amount of information coming at you online is so vast, we have retreated to the network of people that we personally trust, and that might be your family, your friends, the particular people you follow on Twitter, for example, who you don't know. If people here use Twitter, I'm sure you may have come across people you go, I know you from Twitter, because you develop that kind of relationship of trust. And so I think that's one of the most dangerous things, and you're trying to think, how can the media insert themselves in there? And the other thing about the post-truth area is that what people share, it could be from a good place, but a lot of it's motivated by fear. It's what we call in the newsroom the watch out Huns situation, where you see the things going around about, and some of it's true, cut your grapes in half this way, not this way, if you don't want your toddler to choke on them, which I took note of, and other things like the virus, this example, that aren't true. And this is all on a very minor level. So what I'm just saying is that I think we're all possibly a little guilty of the fake news thing, and maybe the media's role now is to really engage with the fact that the information and disinformation that we're trying to kind of intervene and correct or add some authority to the context around it. It's not happening on our platforms. It's not happening on the news that Caitriona is reading out, because that's all fact-checked and wonderful. It's not happening on the journal, I hope, for the most part. It's happening in the comments, or it's happening in Twitter or in your Facebook groups and WhatsApp. And so we have to figure out as a media, how do we insert ourselves into that conversation. So that's why I think rebuilding trust means we have to recognise we're going back to the start a little bit on that. I think we have to start listening to what's being said, realise that the agenda, the top headlines on the radio or on the journal in the morning may not be what people are concerned about. So we have to find ways to hear what they're concerned about, and actually then say to people, we are hearing it and here's how we're responding, and sort of, I suppose, widening our news agenda a little bit to what concerns people have are. With the current 8th referendum campaign is a very important example about that. I think there isn't a person probably in this room who doesn't have a personal opinion about how you feel about it, but I think it's also important to recognise a lot of confusion and to see, can we bring some factual discourse to this debate? And it's really, really emotional. We've done some fact checks and we'll continue to do them on some of the claims going out there. And sometimes, again, I have been a little surprised, but sometimes you have to bring forward that's not true, or this is actually true. It may not be worded in a polite way, and it might be a very emotionally manipulative way that it's used, but it's really important that we're brave enough to say when something is right or something is wrong. The last part of it is, I think, that we can combat the fear factor that I was talking about with a bit of constructive news. I think one of the most interesting things I found until I think Stormophilia and a fact check about the HPV vaccine on the site, our biggest, most looked at story, because online is great, you get great feedback on what people are actually reading and engaging with, was a story that we had written. We do this little series called Would It Work Here? And we look at really interesting things happening abroad and just trying to figure out, in an Irish context, would this be the solution to our waiting list or whatever. And there's a really cool project in the Netherlands where younger people, students, are paid a stipend to live. Now they go through a sort of criteria of checking everything, to live with older people. And also there's kind of nursing homes being built with sort of two sides. That story, which is not really within the Irish context, it was for ages our biggest hitting story for like about 2 years. And I was like, there's a real thirst. It's not good news, because it's not about the dog and surfboard at the end of, whatever. It is about offering solutions that are maybe difficult solutions sometimes, and just kind of maybe trying to figure out, do we only put out there negative vibes all the time? That's, of course we have to do that, that's the whole point. But can we find a way to do a bit more constructive news? That's what I'd like to do a little bit more of. So it's an unfinished project.
I just want to say, if anyone hasn't yet come across the fact check on journal.ie, it is an absolute superb thing, and it takes a lot of resources. It is not a cheap thing to do, and it's a brave thing to do, because once you become the exactly, you put yourself up there then to be fact checked again. And it really is a really positive development that Susan has introduced. And everyone, particularly when we're coming into the referendum time and when we will be coming into the election time, it's a really good resource if you're confused about who to believe about everything. But I do say it is a sorry state of affairs if you can't trust your bridge partner or your dentist. Okay, well, our next speaker, as Susan remarked and as Mandy remarked, told us all about Trump, to many of us who never had heard of really, or really had engaged with Trump any more than this kind of slightly cracked businessman that we'd heard a little bit about. Caitriona has, obviously you know her from her Washington, amazing work in Washington. And now her amazing turn with Keelan on the 6-1, but has also written a really good book. If you want to get into the heart of why Trump happened, Caitriona's book is a very good place to start. So please, Caitriona Perry.
Thanks for the plug, Katie. I'll continue that. New paperback edition out next Friday with an updated chapter. If you can't self-promote, what else can you do? And I think there's a few people still standing at the back. If you don't mind a side angle, there are some seats here at the front, but you will get a profile angle. None of us really like that, but if you need to sit down, there it is. I sort of have a more optimistic view on trust and this notion of a post-truth world. And I think in particular what's happened in the last few weeks with the revelations around Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, even anecdotally, so many people are starting to say to me, of all age brackets and all walks of life, I no longer just share things on Facebook or Twitter or anywhere else. That one incident, and it was massive and worldwide as we know, but has really triggered people into looking again at what you're reading and where it comes from, and like that, if it's from the dentist or the bridge partner, have they actually checked it before they've said it and passed it on? So I think there is a resurgence going on there around sourcing of things, because we're bombarded with information at the moment. It used to be the case that you bought the paper and you found out what had happened yesterday, and you had to wait till 6 o'clock or 9 o'clock to see what had happened that morning. And you don't need that anymore. By the time you get to buy the paper or watch the television or hear a radio bulletin, you've already perhaps heard that story 10 or 15 times already. So it's very hard to root out, in many ways, fact from fiction or opinion. And with all the new, I saw this in the US very much, anyone who had a smartphone called themselves a journalist. But they weren't held to the same rigorous rules and ethics that I am held to, in terms of I can't say anything unless I know 100% that it's true, that I've sourced it at least twice, that it's not going to have any sort of defamation or libel attached to it. But if I'm running my own news website out of the basement of my house with my smartphone and a laptop, I don't have to do any of that, but I could be still getting thousands of hits and shares, and there's a real conversation going on in the media, and Susan has articulated it very well there about what the role is, but it's encouraging to see that people are still relying on the mainstream media for almost now in the role of a curator. As to what's the important news of that day, and if many people say, oh, I heard this story but it wasn't on the RT News, or it wasn't on in a newspaper, or on a website, on the journal, or whatever, so now I have a doubt about, is that actually true, or is that legal, or so I think people do still have that inbuilt alarm bell radar themselves. And just to talk about the US context, because obviously that is where the term fake news originated from then candidate Donald Trump on the campaign trail. And he's such a clever brander and marketeer, and obviously that comes from his background as a reality TV star and ultimately a builder and salesman of large properties. So he started saying fake news about stuff that he just didn't really agree with, and it started originally when analysis would be given of his speeches, mostly by the US networks, and he wouldn't like what people had said because, again, they were fact-checking what he was saying, and he would call that fake news. And now it's come into common parlance, and it no longer, as Susan said, obviously it means something, in English terms it means something that is false, but now it means something you don't agree with. And we all use it now, even in jokes in a pub. Someone says something and you say, oh, that's fake news there, I was home by midnight last night, or whatever. It was not me you saw in the nightclub at 2 a.m. And the other one, of course, being alternative facts. That phrase made famous by Kellyanne Conway, and it's worth just remembering where that phrase actually came from, and it came from the first statement made by the press secretary Sean Spicer the day after the inauguration last year, when he now very famously said that it was the largest audience to ever watch an inauguration ever, period. And Kellyanne Conway was then out on Meet the Press, a show on NBC, on the Sunday the next day, defending this because there was photographic evidence that it wasn't the largest ever audience to watch an inauguration, in person at least. And she coined the term, Sean Spicer was relying on alternative facts. And that's another phrase that has now come into common parlance as well. And when phrases like that are bandied around, they almost get a credibility, and you forget actually where they've come from. When I was thinking about what I was going to say today, and what if I was thinking, do I have to make a speech, and blah, 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 blah. And I was thinking, it's very difficult to make a speech about anything without relying on statistics to argue your point, or in a debate to back it up with facts and statistics. And statistics now are almost unreliable as well, because with the advances of Twitter and Facebook and everything having to be short and squeezed down, no longer do you have to necessarily source something when you make a claim about it. People will tweet something like, 1 in 4 people really wish they had blue hair, but they don't say that's according to the manufacturers of blue hair dye. But people just trot out statistics, and you've no idea of knowing where they came from, what they're based upon. And taking that out to a bigger level is the notion of opinion polls, which again in the 2016 election, and in many elections on this side of the Atlantic as well, didn't actually bear out what happened in the elections that came after them. And of course the classic one was that Hillary Clinton was doing so well in all the opinion polls, and a lot of people were very shocked by the result and said, the opinion polls didn't show that. But actually, if you drill down into many of the opinion polls that were put out during the US election, they're either online polls which are self-selective. So, they're just not measurable if it's, it's like those, please vote for my dog or whatever, and you send the link around. You've no way, it's just, people can be voting 15 times, or they want to vote for that poll or they don't. And even the more, what would have traditionally been reliable opinion polls, when you drill down into how they were conducted, in the US there's an adult voting population of 245 million. Many of those opinion polls, the legitimate ones, had a sample size of 1,000 people. And they're the legitimate polls carried out by all of the reputable polling agencies, media organisations and so on. And in this country we obviously have a much smaller population, but our sample size would be about 1,000 as well. So how you can draw any conclusions on 1,000 people out of a voting population of 245 million, you know, you're already getting into extreme grey areas there. And the reason why so many people didn't see the rise of Donald Trump and we're relying on opinion polls is another point that's is sort of related to what we're talking about, which is the funding of media organisations. Because everything now is about sharing, quick, clickbait, media organisations are no longer funding the shoe leather type of journalism that is required to actually take the temperature of voters or any story in particular. And so that's why it was really the foreign correspondents in the US who saw what was going on, because we were the ones who weren't on the campaign buses and planes and doing live shots 15 times a day into big networks and whatever, because we were actually going off the main roads, around these states, around these cities, and hearing from people who felt so disenfranchised and so left behind. And you know, that's why many people outside America thought maybe Trump might do it, and many people inside America didn't, because they weren't listening to each other. And again, that helps to either create or shatter trust. If people get it wrong, you know, their judgment, their reputation is on the line there as well. And the other point, and again, Susan touched on it, is this fear of experts. And we saw it in particular, I think, with the Brexit referendum in Britain, and we saw it in the US in the 2016 election as well. And that was further fostered by Donald Trump's Drain the Swamp, even though in many ways he's repopulated the swamp himself in terms of, and I'm not saying that in any kind of nasty way, I'm just saying he went in and got rid of a lot of politicos and brought his own people in, but actually now he's gone back around and gone back to those same politicos. You know, we see John Bolton now, former ambassador, in there. We see Rudy Giuliani now on board as Trump's lawyer. So, you know, that's a side point, but this fear of experts, that people don't want to hear something they don't like, and they don't have to anymore because of this wealth of information, this bombardment of information that is out there. You can take your knowledge from whatever source you want to take it from, and if you have a particular opinion, and it's very true in the US more so than here, and as much as people might want to knock RTE, public service media is really important, because myself and Katie and Miriam, you know, we're actually bound to only say things that are true, factual, accurate, objective, neutral, all of that, and that doesn't exist in the US. You know, there's PBS and NPR, but they're funded by having to run basically the equivalent of a telethon once a month, begging people to contribute $10. So they don't have anywhere near the audience share, and a lot of people don't listen to them or read their website content or anything like that. So we're very lucky in many ways there, but it's that there is something going on at a bigger level in terms of people favouring populism and favouring hearing what they themselves want to hear and not trusting experts. And I'm sure we'll dig into that later, but I've spoken for way too long already, so I'll pass on the microphone.
Thanks very much, Caitriona. Really, really fascinating about how the local media missed the story, because, as you say, that investment, people no longer, the money is no longer there to pay for people to find out things, and that is a very fundamental breakage of the system that I wonder, is there any business model way back to fix that? Apart from the license fee that we all pay. Okay, next up we have a really, really impressive young journalist. It's really great, as if you're an old one like myself, to see young journalists coming through who are really passionate and really pushing the boundaries and, you know, pushing back against, and, you know, the old word, speaking truth to power, but it actually, you know, what Ellen has done in the last year, even since in the Times Ireland edition, is it's really, really impressive, and it's really, because, in particular I'm thinking about the strategic communication story, that it did not get a lot of support across the media initially for that story, and there was the reaction politically to it was to kind of shut it down, and I think it was so impressive that Ellen held her ground and stuck with it and just day after day dug on and kept with it until ultimately it was it wouldn't go away, and it had to be dealt with, and we all saw what happened with that. So please, a big welcome for Ellen Coyne.
Thank you so much. I feel under pressure already to live up to that really generous intro. But as Katie said, when we were considering the title of today's talk, I was almost going into like an existential sense of dread, because when I think about truth and objectivity and the importance of journalism, I do get this kind of deep sense of fear when I look at women, in particular my own age, and considering the fact that we're relying on people like me to be the next generation of readers. And like Susan said, you can get a lot of information now online, but the problem with that is there's a big difference between information and journalism. And even when you talk about facts, there are a difference between facts and the truth. And I suppose now, with the way that things are, you do have so much access to information, but it also means that if a newspaper, for example, is campaigning or reporting on something that you don't personally disagree with, you can kind of go onto this online pick and mix where you choose your own facts, which in themselves are absolutely true, but they're not the whole truth. The context is missing, the objectivity is missing, the things that you really require from journalism are missing. And in my own experience, since I started working for the Ireland edition of the Times, we've had a particular focus on, well, I have had a particular focus on doing journalism that is campaigning, particularly on women's issues. So you're being tenacious and aggressive, you are being objective and you are telling the truth, but you're putting facts forward to show the government or to show society that a certain thing should change. For example, in the last couple of months we had a campaign where we kept reporting on the fact that women who are domestic abuse victims who receive social welfare up until a few months ago were required to chase their abusive partners for maintenance. And I mean, that is, it sounds incredible and it sounds like something that it shouldn't have happened. But we were tenacious with that and aggressively wanted to change, but by only presenting the facts. We didn't skew anything, and it was successful. And that's something that journalism should be doing. But the problem is, with the space we're in now, if somebody has a problem with something that you're reporting, whether it's reporting on the 8th Amendment, crisis pregnancy agencies, the National Maternity Hospital, we've turned everything into, instead of newspapers presenting a story and that being it, people feel like that's the start of a conversation. And if they disagree with what you're campaigning on, their voices have been equated with the journalism that you've worked hard on for weeks or months, and we're equating them. In the same way, you know, a decade ago we had this problem where you'd have experts talking about climate change, and we would equate them with literally angry men yelling at clouds and act like they were the same thing. And I find that's the same thing online. And if I have been working on a story and you put it out on Twitter the night before it's published, I don't want to, yes, you know, journalists are open to questions and it's good that we're accessible now and people can talk to us, but I am not going to sit down with you and explain why your opinion is worth the same as the facts that I've put in the newspaper the next day, because it's not the same thing. But we're at a stage now where people think that it is. And as Katie said, she asked me to come on this panel after the Ireland 2040 story, which, to give you a quick review, the government had basically spent millions of taxpayers' money on at least 2 advertising campaigns where a company instructed local media, which could not refuse the ads because they were worth so much money, to make government propaganda look like objective news. So, I mean, we get stuff all the time, RT gets stuff all the time about, you know, you can't trust RT, blah, 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 RT buys Murdoch, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, if you can't, if my mum can't trust the Dungarvan Observer, there's something fundamentally wrong. So it was a good story, you know, let's not act like it was like the Pentagon Papers. But when it came out, it was like, I actually hate telling this story because I feel like I should be wearing a tinfoil hat and I feel like Will Smith, an enemy of the state, because what happened next was so unbelievable, it actually defies, you're going to have to suspend your disbelief. So Leo Varadkar loved this strategic communications unit, which was responsible for the Ireland 2040 campaign, which is the one at the centre of the story. And he came out the next day and was at a doorstep, and a reporter at the Irish Times asked him, put our story to him, and he said, that's not true. And because Leo Varadkar said that at a doorstep, that carries weight and is reportable. So journalists would have been able to report Leo Varadkar has denied blah blah, even though my story was 100% true, has since been vindicated by a review that Leo Varadkar ordered himself from his own Secretary General. But because he said that, that's seen as the truth. And now I'm in conflict with Leo Varadkar, even though he hasn't had to do anything to prove that my story isn't true. So it dragged on and it got worse, and then it became a political row. Like Fianna Fáil were so happy with us, like absolutely thrilled. It was deeply uncomfortable for me, obviously, but you have to put those biases aside. So it came up in the Dáil and it started becoming an emotional argument instead of a fact-based one. It says, oh, you know, when you wrecked the country, you did this blah blah and you did blah blah blah. And because the argument became two-sided, the Taoiseach was able to say extraordinary things without backing them up about me on the Dáil record. And it was all sorts of nonsense, picking this and picking, and it sounded like he was sitting in the department of the Taoiseach late at night with a little microscope and a copy of the Ireland edition of the Times, going through every little font that he could find to see what he could undermine. But it got worse and worse, to the point that he stood up in the Dáil the following Wednesday and said that the anonymous people in my story, obviously these journalists feared that they would lose their jobs if they were on the record, with good reason. He said that those anonymous sources were Fianna Fáil politicians, and that it had been orchestrated by Fianna Fáil. And that carries weight. And I have since heard a senior political correspondent at another paper repeat that argument, that I was basically working for Fianna Fáil, somehow managed to plant the idea of a strategic communications unit 2 years ago and then garner it for Micheál Martin's benefit. And obviously we are all objective and we would never, argue in favour of a certain political party. But anyone who even had a cursory knowledge of me knew if I was going to do that, it would have been like the Dungarvan Tidy Towns Committee before it would have been Fianna Fáil. Like, that was just not credible at all. But I mean, that's been out there, and yes, the SCU is shut down now, and yes, we were vindicated in the report, but those things that the report only focused on my story. The report never sought to verify or debunk everything that Leo Varadkar said. So those things are out there now as true on the Dáil record, the record of Leinster House, and there's nothing I can do about it. Like, there's nothing I can do about it at all. And that's really annoying, but also kind of terrifying when you feel like, again, tinfoil hat time, but when you feel like the whole government can just decide that you're wrong. And again, this was a story about advertising. It wasn't a kind of Pentagon Papers level thing. But what's going to happen when it is? Like, it's early in Leo Varadkar's career, and it's not specific to him, it could be any politician. Is that something that's going to keep happening? So I suppose when I was thinking again, to go back to the start of this talk and what I was thinking about the truth and my generation in particular, and I say this with as much self-awareness as possible. I'm really proud of all the stuff I do on women's rights issues, and I stand by all of it, but one of the consequences, good or bad, is it's the kind of journalism that gets you sent a lot of emojis on Twitter from young feminists being like, yes girl, it's so important. That is great, but I was asked to do a podcast recently, and it was very your journalism is so important for women. I was like, yeah. And the presenter was like, oh, you had this great story about something I think it was the Morning After Pill or something like that, and she was like, I really enjoyed the first 3 paragraphs, but I don't have a subscription, so I wasn't able to read the rest. And I was absolutely incandescent, and I was conscious there was a microphone in front of me, so I was like, but I left and I was actually so angry. We get so many women coming to us all the time being like, it's so great to have a young woman in media bringing up young women's issues. How can you expect me to be able to do that if you are not willing to pay for this news? If you're still getting your news from, algorithms that are getting tweets together, and you're retweets are not going to keep the paper going. That's just not possible. So I mean, I know this isn't me trying to feather my nest. My salary is not in proportion to the subscriptions. I'm genuinely having like an esoteric moment about the future of journalism. I think that we really needed to get it through, particularly to people my age, that the truth now is a luxury and you have to be willing to pay for it.
I have to say, I do think the future of journalism is in pretty good hands. I'd also like to say, Ellen, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they're not all out to get you. Okay, coming up, we have our secret panelist, Deirdre. Please bring it on. I'm not going to tap dance. I was thinking about it, but it's probably a bit much for the morning time. My name is Deirdre. I'm the editor of the 96 FM Opinion Line. I recognise some faces there in the audience. Hi, Miriam and Nina. They're my aunt's friends. I'm really nervous. I'm just glad you didn't bring Mary. Okay, so I am the editor of the 96 FM Opinion Line. So is anyone here from Cork? Oh, okay, and another lady, obviously, and another lady. So basically, local radio and phone-in radio in particular was like the comment section before there was the internet. We know what people are really saying because they say it to us at high volume in the morning on the phone. Sometimes they're drunk. No, really. And there's a lot of problems out there and we know about all of them. But we're the sort of first port of call for a particular generation with concerns, with issues, with their views on things that I think, and I'm really glad the D4 bubble came up, because this is, I suppose, where we actually are ahead a little bit of national media and of particularly, I suppose, newspapers and shows that don't have a public input. We know what the public are concerned with. So talking about Facebook, Susan probably and I would be the most similar in terms of actually what we see coming into us or what we hear coming into us all the time. Because what we get is the raw, unvarnished, unpolished, unfact-check view of ordinary people. So everybody knows, right, that carrots are good for your eyes. Yeah? Are carrots good for your eyes? Fact? Okay, no. Alright, like they're a bit good for your eyes in the same way as other orange things that have, is there retinol or whatever are good for your eyes. There's some chemical property of them that is like vaguely good for your eyes, but they're no better for your eyes, for example, than sweet potatoes or I think ordinary potatoes. That is a piece of propaganda put out by the British Army, I think it was in either World War I or World War II, I'm a bit sketchy on this, put out to hide the fact that the Brits had radar, and that's how their pilots knew where German targets were. So that is a piece of propaganda that we all now pretty much accept as fact. We say to your kids, eat your carrots, they're good for your eyes. They're not! Okay, so you can stop that right away. They're good for other things. So I suppose the biggest thing for me when we're talking about truth is truth has always been manipulated. Has anyone heard of Perkin Warbeck? No? Okay. He was like an imposter that was brought along as a member of the British royal family in the 15th century. And everyone went, that's actually the real prince. He was one of the princes in the tower. And they tried to cause a civil war over him. More propaganda. This has always gone on. And people in power have always tried to manipulate the facts to suit them and to fool you and I. And journalism is a very recent addition to this mix. Up until the 1800s or whatever, you believed whatever was told to you because you probably couldn't read anyway. And you believed what you heard. And I think in some ways we're kind of gone back to that a bit with the under-resourcing of journalism. You believe what your friends tell you. And going back to the dentist and the bridge partner, I thought that was really good, right? Because up to about 5 years ago, there was sort of a common thing where you would say, well, I'm not going to go to my bridge partner for advice on my teeth. Okay, obviously you wouldn't. These days,
your dentist tells you need X, Y, Z, or your doctor, for example, more commonly, tells you, for example, that your children need to be vaccinated, and instead you go, I don't really like the sound of that, and you go on Facebook and ask a load of people on a mom group, should I get my kids vaccinated? And they say, no, give them some turmeric, they'll be fine. And this happens all the time. So, like, this is where we're back to. We're kind of back to a pre-literate age, where we're all just going, well, do you know what, Mary and the butcher has told me actually the vaccinations aren't really a real thing, so I think I won't get my kids vaccinated. Because her opinion is actually the same as years and years of research and science and people not dying of polio. So this is the thing, I suppose, on the show that I work on, it's called The Opinion Line. That's what it is. It's you can ring in and say whatever you want as long as you don't defame someone and you don't say anything that's likely to get us in legal trouble, basically, or you, but more often us. And funny enough, people never understand that we're the ones that will get sued and not them. They're like, sure, I have nothing. We're like, but we do. We have jobs. They can take my house, not mine. So we have a 3-hour show. So if you listen to Liveline, we're broadly similar to Liveline, except Liveline is what? Is it an hour and a half? Yeah, an hour and 15 minutes, and they have 8 people on their production team. We have 2, and it's a 3-hour show, and it's on every day. So it's a lot of people talking about a lot of things in a 3-hour space. We could have 30 people on air saying different things. So our job much of the time is to challenge what those people are saying, to make sure we have an opponent to them if it's something that is an honestly held view. For example, everybody had a view on the Ulster trial. After the trial, obviously during it we couldn't discuss it. Every single person in this room has their own view on that. All of them will differ, even in a very minute way, about some particular point, because we had so much detail on it. And we had those discussions. We try and make sure the discussions are balanced, but part of the remit of our show is actually to show what people are thinking. And sometimes people aren't thinking in balance. They're not thinking in 50-50. You know, in referenda you have this rule where you have to have 50-50. That's rubbish, because a lot of the time it's 80-20 in what people are actually thinking. So a lot of the job can be filtering that in such a way as that you coming on with your opinion about giving turmeric to people with cancer is not going to harm people listening to the show. And that is the thing that we really, really struggle with, because we find that these days people put the weight of their own opinion, as was said earlier, right up there with the considered, researched, proven view of any expert in any field. And I suppose the thing about this is that it's good to challenge authority. It's good to challenge a politician who tells you that that story in the paper isn't true. Is it good to challenge the guy who has spent 40 years researching whether turmeric cures cancer and found that no, it doesn't, but that it might be kind of good for you if you have some every so often? No, if you know nothing about it, then it isn't. But we have had to balance that with acknowledging that people believe these things, addressing it and talking to them, but not like they're idiots. And this has been, for me as a journalist, the biggest struggle in adapting to this role. I came up through newspapers, I have a law degree, I'm a facts person, I'm a research person. I think most journalists across the media in general have probably a very similar way of looking at the world. And that doesn't mean we all have the same view on abortion or whatever the issue of the day is. It doesn't mean that. But it means that we assume that other people look at the world in the same way, that they will say, well, that's a factual source and this person is right because they have the research. And that is not the case. And we can't talk down to people who heard from their neighbour that whatever it is, because they have concerns, they have worries, they're living in the same world as the rest of us, and they're making decisions for their families based on the things that they believe to be authoritative and true. So one thing I suppose that life experience is a very important thing in this job as well. And during my maternity leave, I joined all these mom Facebook groups, because it's the middle of the night and you have no one to ask about, is this level of vomiting normal, because your husband is asleep, and you're like, I don't know if this is a thing that they all do. And you look at these groups, and these groups are where now people go, instead of the neighbour popping in for a cup of tea during the day while the husband is at work and you're doing the washing. That's where women used to share information. Now it's in these groups. And it is predominantly women who I think are part of this subculture, I suppose you'd nearly call it, And what I saw on this was these questions about vaccines, these questions about all of these different very important, very scientific topics where there is real authority out there. And those questions are happening there in a space that nobody is controlling and nobody is in real authority there. And I said the media are doing all of these people a complete disservice because we are not even acknowledging that they have those fears. We are putting on Dr. X from the HSE to say, yes, get your children vaccinated, blah, 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 blah. And when someone rings in to say, well, I heard vaccinations cause X, Y, and Z, we're not even putting them on air because we're saying, oh, that's dangerous, we can't, encourage that. But since coming back from that maternity leave, I have changed my tune on this. And what we now do is if the person is measured and is asking a question that people legitimately have, we will bring them on and say, you have this concern. And if they have this concern, then another 1,000 people listening to us that day have that concern as well. And that is something that I think has been one of the media's biggest failures, nationally, locally, internationally. And I think it is the reason that we did not see the likes of the Trump election coming. Nobody was listening or taking those people seriously, except maybe on a very local, granular level where you have local Facebook pages, local phone-in shows, where people were able to come on and say, well, look, I have this issue and I'm afraid that the immigrants, the Mexicans are going to steal my job, whatever. And, in Washington or in Dublin or in London, the journalist who's the editor of whatever it is going, I know that's rubbish. But, say I live in Cove, it's a deprived area, it's a very, an unemployment black spot. Well, maybe a lot of Polish people have come in and are working in jobs that are not for people with very high level of qualifications, and that people are looking at them and going, oh, well, maybe I would have liked that job, but I don't have the skills for it, or whatever it is. People have concerns that the media don't always address and don't always acknowledge exist. And I think one of the things for us in establishing this truth and establishing that trust back with people is actually saying, we're not going to treat you like an idiot. You are part of a conversation here. It is our job to bring you the facts, but not in such a way that we're saying, you're a gobshite, don't worry about that, we have it under control. And I think a lot of the time, that's been the tone that people get from the media. I think it was Caitriona mentioned this notion of the RT bias. And that was something that, go back to the water protests. I mean, we literally could have spent, I think we did spend a whole year talking about water protests every single day. I literally never want to hear about water again. I don't care what happens. I'd probably just resign if they try and bring in. Genuinely, I'm so bored of it. And I think most people kind of are. But the issue with this is where social media has taken hold and where these legitimate concerns of people necessarily are not being addressed. I think people were able to develop this meme of an RT bias and say, well, because RT reported, say, somebody in the housing estate isn't happy that they're blockading the water meters because they can't get to work. I mean, we had that on the show one day. They were saying, I'm sick of these protesters, would they ever go away? I can't get in and out of my house, they're intimidating. And we were accused of bias then, of course, it was the Rupert Murdoch bias then that time, because that's owns us. But this hashtag RTE bias is everywhere. So now we could follow up on a story that RTE have covered on the show and say, what do you think of that? Will we discuss that today? And they say, oh, that's only RTE bias, we don't believe it. Genuinely, and I just say, well, if you don't believe RTE, guys, like, everyone believe us. But they do if they don't have a thing about Rupert Murdoch. So now there's this unshakable belief among a whole cohort of the population that RTE is biased. And that maybe a lot of the people who are involved in water protests are maybe also involved in things like this legalised medicinal cannabis movement. So witness, for example, the People of the Year controversy, where there are claims now that RTE censored Vera Twomey's speech because the government didn't like it. RTE in general, I would imagine, is not in the business of doing things because the government likes or doesn't like them. Probably from a totally practical point of view, it was probably too long. Vera's she's got a lot to say. She's got an awful lot to say, and she can be very hard to contain between ad breaks, put it like that in my experience. Medical stuff for us is actually the biggest thing where we find we should do the most fact checking for people. Someone will ring in and say, too many vaccinations, the medical industry is trying to sell us chemotherapy and it doesn't actually do anything for you, or whatever, and we will try our best to actually address that and not say, oh, whatever, tinfoil hat time. I suppose, going back to the Dublin, the D4 bubble, that is, for me, actually one of the things where you talk about the under-resourcing of media, you talk about the hollowing out of a lot of media organisations, particularly on the ground, where people don't have the daily contact with the public, say, that we have. There's only 2 of us, we are not a big research team. People ring in and say, I spoke to one of your researchers, and they're like, well, it was either me or it was Fergal, and I think you can tell the difference. But sometimes we put on voices just to sound like there's loads of us. But only when it's really boring and everyone's talking about water protests or something. But you know, you end up with this sort of, and I really hate this phrase, so I'm sorry, but this sort of media elite. And there is a bit of a Dublin thing where, you know, they all know each other, they've all worked together for a long time, and people know each other. I mean, that's the way society works. Like, that's not an intentional thing or a snob thing or anything like that. It's just an accident of geography and of where most of the power is in the country. And because of that, there is very much a divide between Dublin and other parts of the country, and between rural Ireland and urban Ireland. And I would even, Cork City and County Cork even are very different in that respect. And there is a sense that this gap between experts and everybody else is widening all the time. And that's something, I think that's where the trust issue is. And that's where, you know, this is, I suppose, the best example of it that I've even heard this week. I was trying to think of something from our own show, and actually the best thing this week was anybody listening to Ray Darcy during the week when they were discussing the smartphone ban on in Blennerville? And they had a guy on from DCU who is an expert in cyberbullying and all this kind of stuff and kids using smartphones. And all the parents ringing in, and we had this as well, were all saying, this is a great idea, this ban, this is the best thing that ever happened, take the kids away from smartphones, blah, blah, blah. And the guy from DCU was like, the research shows that it doesn't work. And every single comment that went in says, well, you have your research, but I know my child. And then Ray asked him the killer question and said, are you a parent yourself?
That was it.
Credibility gone. The guy has only got a PhD and spent the last 15 years actually researching this. And that was it, and that was the end of the discussion. And I think that's where our problem is. You know, so until we actually establish that, you know, experts are not against everyone, and it is the media's job, I think, to be that bridge a lot of the time. And I suppose how we do that is maybe the next step for us. So thank you very much, people of Not Dublin. I think that Dee really captured a really fundamental development and the new reality, which is it's not about facts, it's about feelings. It's, you know, and Mandy will understand this more than most as a former government press secretary. In politics, it's always about the feelings, isn't it? You don't win elections with facts. You win elections by manipulating feelings. Not that you would ever do that, Mandy. Okay, our final panelist, Miriam, you might have noticed from your brochures there that we had hoped to have Dr. Mary Aiken join us this morning. Unfortunately, she had she's out of the country as it happens, unavoidably. But I did ask Miriam to stand in at the very last minute. Now, I'm not going to drag her up here and do a prepared 10 minutes to go up against those excellently prepared addresses we've had. But I'm going to kick off this, and I'm going to be opening it all out to you guys very soon, so have your questions ready. But maybe, Mary, you might just start off for us then. That whole issue about experts and our responsibility to not shove this down people's throats, and how we represent what we're telling people. And I think, you know, even you saying the Dublin 4 thing, like, we've been at editorial meetings, Miriam will attest to this. When stuff to do with rural issues comes up, there's actually not an awful lot of people in our office who are born and bred rural, like myself. And you'd be kind of saying, no, you don't understand. This is why this is important. And it actually is quite hard to explain to somebody who has never, you know, been near a cow or, had cow shit on their shoes going to school. It's very hard to explain to somebody. It really is, because you're just from such a different milieu, and it's hard to. And there is definitely, and I've had this row with my husband. There is definitely a bit of condescension of the, you know,
just not as sophisticated as we are, kind of thing. So until we actually acknowledge that, look at it straight in the face, say this is what we believe, and say it is not really a way to go forward, because you're not going to bring anyone with you with that attitude. Miriam.
Well, actually, yeah, I have the privilege of sharing, as I told a few people last night, a small office off the primetime office with Katie. But interestingly, in our office, Katie is a fully true-blown Kerry woman, right, from Dowa up the road. But my dad is from Currow, which is just up the road, and two other women in our offices, fathers and grandfathers, are also from Knocknagoshel. So we always say there's a very large rural, especially Kerry contingent in our certain part of the office. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Before I make it, I just want to say, if you look at the title, it's about can trust be rebuilt in the post-truth era? Well, having listened to the 4 female journalists here beside me, I feel pretty safe that it can. I just want to say that. And I also just want to acknowledge, I personally believe and have always believed that journalism matters to the narratives of ordinary people. That if you are there to tell the truth as it is, as much as possible through the personal stories of individuals, then you are doing it right and you won't go wrong. And sitting in front of me is someone who is a trailblazer for that, who did it as an example for all of us women on this panel. And I just want to pay tribute to you now, McCafferty. I just love Nell. I just want to put that out there. Not in that way, Nell, but I just love you, okay? You'd never take on the 8 kids anyway, so forget about it. But yeah, I think it's really important. I was sitting here thinking that in the past, say, couple of months, for me anyway, I think journalism will work through telling people's truthful stories. So I remember talking to Alan Black. He was the only survivor of the Kingsmill massacre. Now you can do endless documentaries, and you can make endless programs that are factual, that there are no lies in, that the statistics are correct. But in fact, if you interview the only survivor of that massacre and get him to tell you his personal story of what happened at that moment on the day and the repercussions of all of that, not just for him personally, but for everybody in Northern Ireland and on this island, that was so powerful. So I have great confidence that truth is restored. In fact, I believe truth has never been lost. I think as journalists, if we stick to what we do and tell the truth and allow others tell their truths through us, then we're safe and the truth is safe. That's what I feel.
Is there anyone with an immediate burning? Sarah. Sarah Carey at the front.
Sorry, I always sit up the front and ask the first question. It's my job and stuff. Brilliant presentations by everybody. On experts though, and I'm Susan, the fact check thing is brilliant. What freaks me out is, why is that so rare? Imagine that you are the only person in Ireland running this series fact checking. That is...
Can I just say,
all right,
we do some fact checking in RTE.
But the verification, the fact that it's certified.
But this is the only running ongoing.
And questioning assertions. And I find that particularly broadcasters are too dependent on a polarised conversation in which you get person A, the other person on the very opposite side of the argument, throw them into a studio, they can knock lumps out of each other, each of them make whatever assertions that they want. The rest of us are listening to this row, which is supposedly now being billed as entertainment rather than information. And no one learns anything, no one is persuaded. And that there should be more experts, Deirdre, like you were saying, in the studio who can actually tell us something and don't have votes to gain out of it or clicks to gain out of it. Their only interest is in actually telling us something. So why not more experts in the studios?
That's a good point. I'll actually, though, that there's probably, I think that it's a case of, it's not just doing the very worthy fact checking. So if you do go and look at our fact check thing, and if you Google fact check the journal.ie, you get the string of them. And we actually, it's really resource heavy, okay? I can't get this I can't get it funded externally because to attach brands to the fact check project is kind of problematic. It's also the case that it's not very sexy. Okay, so there's part of your problem. Now, Sarah, what turns you on is just maybe something entirely different from most population. But anyway, so Sarah, you're more than welcome to sponsor a fact check. But the thing is that I've had to take money out of the newsroom budget and find it from Rob and Peter by paying Paul. We're not particularly well resourced either because we're completely independent and not in receipt of funding. We're commercial, we're looking for people's eyeballs. But I have found that the way to develop it, there is actually always a way, right? If you really want to do it. And it's lovely to want to do the best journalism you can. I'm in the reality business of I have to keep all of my newsroom in a job. It is a commercial entity and I have to find ways to make this work. So what we found with Fact Check was that thing I said about inserting the fact check into people's conversations where they're actually happening and it may not be on the site. We'll produce the fact check, which because we're signed up to that IFCN set of principles, we have to have, like you link out, we create spreadsheets of the raw materials so you can check it yourself, so everything is transparent and they tend to be really, really long. I doubt most people get to the bottom of the fact check and to that point we actually started moving the verdict up to the top so you could do a synopsis read, because I'm sure people were not getting to the end of 3,000 words and going through all our spreadsheets. I am a realistic person, right? Because this is online, you read the headline, you leave a comment. I'm thinking of maybe bringing in a section for the journal where you have to pass a test, as I saw some Norwegian paper did, where you have to pass a test on what the content of the piece is before you're allowed to leave a comment. You have to get like 3 out of 5 or something. I think amazing, right? That forcing people to become experts by educating themselves. So with the fact check, what we've also started doing, and we haven't had many recently because I've had to concentrate on the 8 stuff, but we're bringing it back in as part of the 8, so we're going to have a big flurry of them in the next month, is that we have found ways of producing fact checks in a way that's accessible to people. So when it's information that's being going around online, I'll give you a quick example of one. It was when the Lewis drivers were striking against Transdev. And for some reason there was really bad public opinion against the Lewis drivers striking. And I was like, Transdev's a private company. Is this what the GPO was all about? It's like, since when are we against workers asking for more rights? But anyway, so Lewis drivers, and memes started going around comparing them to what junior doctors at the time were looking for. And it was highly emotive. It was like junior doctors just wanted some sleep and a few more grand. And the Lewis drivers start on this and they have 18 months training versus 8 years training and all this kind of stuff. So what we did was we fact-checked the meme and we corrected the meme and we put a new meme out and said, this is the meme you should share. And it is true that the junior doctors are really hard done by here, but it's not quite true what was being put out about what the Lewis drivers were looking for, and also the two don't really compare. And so we asked people to share that. Now, of course, it didn't get as many shares as the much sexier and snappier earlier one, but we just felt like that was the right way to have that contribution. More recently, I have been presenting our fact checks on Pat Kenny's show on Wednesday nights on TV3, and particularly in the previous season when I had more time. And the great thing about that was I would write the script. I would get the fact check done with our team. I would write the script for it. I would advise their graphics people what to do. And we used to get the fact check presented in, I think it was like 90 seconds or 2 minutes. And believe me, when you've Pat Kenny towering over you, like going, you can't see it, he's brilliant on camera, but he's looking in your eyes going, move it on, move it on, move it on. And you're like, well, Pat, my verdict is it's completely false. But the great thing was that we had the very small piece of video at the end, which we were then able to circulate on social media afterwards, and we have a big reach. So people who never get to the bottom of the fact check would get that information some other way. Ellen's point about, and do you know what, Ellen, you're dead right, it's not to take a pot at Leo Varadkar. He happens to be the one with the microphone right now, as Taoiseach, right? But he did something similar back in November around homelessness rates in an international comparison. And he called one of my reporters a liar in front of everyone. And I had one of his advisors ring me up just before I was about to go on fact check on Pat Kenny that night and said, he had a Fine Gael TD in the green room, and he said, I've heard you going on, this particular advisor, I've heard you're about to go on, Pat Kenny, to talk about this international homeless rate, blah, blah, blah. And he said, of course, it's not, you are right, and whatever, but it was the way the question was asked. And I was literally like, tell it to my left one, I'm about to go on the television here. So, you know, it was that sense of like, you can't argue with it. So it's about, can we amplify what we're doing? That's what I think. I think Miriam's point about listen to what people are talking about. One of the first things we, like in maybe 2011, 2012, I started getting a lot of feedback, as Dee is saying, from people in Leitrim talking about fracking. And I swear to God, I stood up in the newsroom and said, what the hell is fracking? That was the title of the first piece we did about fracking. Because I was like, well, if that's my question, as someone who considers herself in the know and clearly isn't, and I am from Tipperary, so I'm a bit outside the T4 bubble, but we don't have a problem with fracking because we feck all in Tipperary anyway. And you know, and that built up, it wasn't really us, but we, you know, there was a conversation about it. Primetime did something about a month around that time after. Sunday Times did something as well, and it started gaining momentum. And it really, all of that was all of us probably getting feedback from. This was not on the political agenda at all. It was just councils were passing it through, they were allowing this exploration, and it was, you know, it really needs to be tested. I'm not saying fracking shouldn't happen. I think that it's still a conversation that's ongoing, but there's a temporary ban. Because gradually councils fell around the country and said, hold on. And that's where where you can have a brilliant relationship between the stories that are out there if we listen enough, but then we apply the journalistic rigour to doing it. And then the last missing part, I think, which has been missing, is how do we get the information back out there without presuming that they're going to come directly always to us. I think there are creative ways, and I love something like this, because the ideas we get around it. I don't know if Senator Alice Mary Higgins is in the audience right now. Hi. She gave me a great tip last night about something about stopping fake news pop-ups, and we're going to have a chat about that at another stage. She's been doing amazing work actually on all this. She's really deep diving, and that's the kind of like even these events. What's happening off the stage is brilliant. So thanks for the invite. It's brilliant.
To stand up and kind of talk loudly, I'd say we could probably. Oh no, there's a mic getting to you.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to.
You might introduce yourself.
My name is Helen Hall. I'm CEO of the Policing Authority, and it's just going back on Sarah's question, because I just want to offer a contrary view to the notion of experts or people who might know facts. You know, I've worked in public service agencies for the last 15 years, and we have a fear. And I would say the recipients of being interviewed to protect the reputation of our organisations. And we've often been asked to go on to talk about something, and the reaction would be, yes, they're asking us to come on about that particular topic, but we'll be asked something totally different, and we will be, you know, we'll be pushed in other directions, and we'll be forced to create the sort of entertainment, I think, that you referred to, will be on the other side. So there's a fear factor, I would say. Now, I'm not putting myself in the category of an expert, but I would say the same thing of academics I've spoken to, who would say, well, they're going to bring me on for that, but actually, I'm going to lose out on this. So I would just put that to you, that in terms of that, getting that other voice, there needs to be some piece of protection for who you interview as well, and then you might get the other side. So that's just a comment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, that's a really good point. Maybe, Caitriona, would you just, I mean, when you talk about trust, the trust is not just between us and the audience or the reader, but obviously between our contributors and.
Yeah, I would just say to that, you know, we're journalists, and if you're invited to go on and use a current affairs programme and you say yes, we can't ethically not ask you what the questions of the day are if they relate to what your subject matter or expertise is, because then the audience loses trust in us, because it becomes, oh, you didn't ask the person about the elephant in the room. And so you then and your organisation are weakened, and you are trying to, you know, the argument will come back that you are trying to protect whatever government minister, agency, expert, academic. This is a very squeaky chair. I'm bouncing too much here. So, you know, there is a balance there, and I think anyone who's risen to the level of expertise in their field is an expert. And you know, I say this to a lot of women. Sometimes they say they're afraid to go on panels, or they're afraid to interview something, and you're trying to reassure people that if you've got that job as chief executive or of whatever, or professor of whatever, it's because you're good enough and you know the subject matter, and not to be afraid of it. But equally, if you say yes, You know, like I said yes to come along here, whatever people ask me, I've no idea. I'm going to have to answer it whether I like it or not, because, you know, that's part of the job that I have, and it's agreeing to do something. We all just have to be sometimes a little bit braver than that. And, you know, kind of to Sarah's point about putting people on, as the presenter or the journalist, you're not in control of what that other person's going to say. If they suddenly start shouting and raising their voice up and saying something crazy, it's live television, it's live radio, so you can try and protect the debate as best you can. But and we hear it on our radio programs in particular all the time, people starting to scream at each other. It's more difficult to do in a television setting. And the presenter can intervene as best they can, but if two other free-thinking individuals are going for each other's jugglers, like the journalist, the producer, the researcher, whoever asked you on, didn't necessarily know, but mostly definitely didn't know that was going to happen. So, no, I don't fully agree with you there, because I think it's not good radio or television if two people are screaming at each other and the third person is like, lads, leave it out, leave it out. You know, there was an excellent debate on Morning Ireland yesterday morning, I think, to do with the referendum, with two lawyers who were taking opposing positions, and possibly because they were lawyers, they were very measured in their delivery, and it was a slightly more left field type of discussion that was going on. And I feel from a listener's perspective and from a programme maker's perspective, that is actually what you want. Yes, you want a discussion and an argument and a debate, but it's actually in no one's interest for people to be shouting over each other. And, you know, I'm just back in Ireland now 3.5 months, but I've noticed a big difference in what's on all of our airwaves. I'm not talking about RT in particular here, but everywhere. The ante has been upped, and more people are now launching into that. I'm going to shout over you and win the argument, I'm going to win the argument, I'm still not going to stop talking because then I'll have to win. You know, and that didn't exist there before, and that's not the journalist's fault. People who are going on programmes are doing that themselves. No one's prodding you, go, shout louder, quickly, shout. You know, that doesn't happen, so.
Can I come in on that actually? Just, I suppose as a producer on a very commercial show, we're chasing ratings, that's my job. I'd be sacked if I didn't. And we're in an extremely competitive environment. We have, I don't know, people don't know the history outside of Cork because no one cares. But there's two shows. Neil Prendeville is the other one. People may be familiar with that name. And no, never heard of it. And we're in a very, very competitive environment. And what I will say is, I like the kind of measured, factual debate that Sarah is talking about. Your show, Sarah News Talk, was an excellent example of actually learning things from a programme about a topic. And I always am like, let's get this expert on to talk about whatever it is. I mean, at the moment, Patrick Street in Cork is closed 3 hours in the afternoon. They're all going absolutely demented about it. It's an amazing victory, actually, of they talked it down so much that people have stopped coming into the city at all. But it's only 3 hours and no one drives down Patrick Street. Personally, I don't get it. Please do not tweet that. That's my personal view. But so we got an expert on to talk about, you know, the residents were complaining that an area where the traffic was diverted to was full of air pollution, and it was a disgrace, and there's too many trucks driving past them. I mean, trucks don't really drive down Patrick Street anyway, so there weren't that many new trucks. So we got an expert out from UCC to monitor the new air pollution in their area, and it had actually gone down. And they were like, oh, well, I suppose it's not that bad after it. But what I have found in the ratings war is that the listeners who listen to our show are mostly in a demographic where they would be tabloid readers. These days, I suppose that means you're getting your news online really primarily, but it's not an RTE Irish Times demographic, which is what most journalists would have come up through themselves, and what you would think that's where you're going to get your most factual information from. They're not that demographic. They do want the Punch and Judy show. We have had cases where, say, Enda Kenny is on a trip to Cork and we interview him, and we have a list of questions for him of very local significance, and we've come away from that interview going, brilliant, he didn't know a fucking thing about the airport, he didn't know anything about this. We've actually nailed him where he doesn't have a clue, he doesn't even know where Cork is, he just got driven here, and we've nailed him, you know, and he's actually kind of like, blah, 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 at the end of it. But he has gone to our competitor, who has gone, you don't know, and then he's gone, but if you just let me in and let me answer the question, he's gone at him. And people have gone, that was a brilliant interview. And I'm looking at their Facebook video of this and our Facebook video of this, and I've gone, we learned that Enterclain knows nothing about the traffic problems in Cork, he knows nothing about the airport, he knows nothing about the ring road that doesn't exist because they never funded it, he knows nothing about the road between Limerick and Cork, it has no plans to build one, and they learned that the other presenter likes shouting at people and people don't like being shouted at. And that's the interview that went viral. So there is an audience for the Punch and Judy show, and it's a very big audience. I mean, that's what wins in our show. And personally, I'm listening to it going, how can anyone be listening to people roaring at each other like that? And then afterwards, we'll get phone calls going, geez, that was great entertainment. So there is an audience for it, and it depends, I suppose, on what side of the balance you think the duty to educate, inform and entertain falls on. And in commercial radio, unfortunately, entertainment is going to win because that's where you get the numbers from. The other question, I have a question for you. I have a question for you, and it's prior to Helen's comment. Sorry, Helen, this is not.
I'm going to give us 3 more minutes because we're running way over.
Fake news,
Yes.
misinformation,
Yes.
Morris McCabe.
We definitely cannot do that in 3 minutes.
Ask her about it in the bar.
Yeah, I mean and I'm not joking about that, but that is a thesis. That is a full-scale dissertation on how you. But it's also the oldest one in the book. It's if somebody is going to become a problem for the system, what you do is you absolutely discredit that person in every way possible. And as we know now, well, we have to wait for what the tribunal finds, but it appears that the most extraordinary extreme lengths were done to discredit that story. And once you discredit the source of the story, so funny in that sense, suddenly everything that's attached to that then is suspect and, there's more to that, that's the line you get. The more thing that, at the very beginning of my coverage of Morris McCabe, the number of people who said to me in a sort of can't say any more, but there's more to that. And that's all you need to say. Because if you're a journalist, and honestly, if I hadn't been in possession of particular information very early on in this story, I would have run a mile from it. Because actually, it would have been a very difficult story to stick with, given what was being said and what you were being assured was the situation. And you don't want as a journalist to end up with, supporting the wrong, backing the wrong horse or something as really serious as this. So, luckily for Morris McCabe, John McGuinness stuck with him in circumstances where, most people may not have. And, some media stuck with him as well. And, well, as we say, we'll wait for the tribunal report. I will not, preempt that. Unfortunately, I can't believe this, but we're in here over an hour and a half, and we have to clear this room for the next fantastic